Chomsky, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Rick Traynor, Principal of King's College London, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to this event sponsored by the International State Crime Initiative, which, as many of you know, is an increasingly successful center of intellectual excellence. And the initiative's new international journal, State Crime, which is being launched here tonight, is something we're very proud to host here at King's College London. Now, it's not my role to introduce tonight's speaker, but before I introduce the person who is going to introduce him, I'd like to say just a word of welcome on behalf of the college to Professor Noam Chomsky. Now, King's College London has two basic purposes. One is to carry out excellent academic activities, especially teaching and research, and the other is to be of service to society. And in respect of both of these basic purposes, we could hardly have a more appropriate speaker than Noam Chomsky. As far as academic excellence is concerned, he's really in a class by himself. He has taught at MIT for no fewer than 56 years, and he's still teaching. And in terms of research, he is arguably the most influential scholar ever, certainly the most influential scholar of the second half of the 20th century and what we've seen so far of the 21st century, with influence not only in his own discipline of linguistics, but very far beyond that. And with regard to service to society, he is, without any doubt, one of the most distinguished commentators on the world beyond academe, a role that he's been pursuing for nearly as long, perhaps as long, as he's been teaching at MIT. He's someone, of course, who has been the subject of considerable controversy in this role as a commentator. But even those who disagree with him would have to concede that he cares very much about the wider world, and he has had a very considerable impact on it. So on all these grounds, he's a very appropriate speaker for King's College London, and it's a great honor for us to have him here as a speaker this evening. I'd now like to hand over to Professor Penny Green, director of the center and one of the editors of the journal, and it will be her proper task to introduce Professor Chomsky. Penny.
Move it this way slightly so everybody can see. Well, we're delighted to welcome you all here this evening to launch the International State Crime Initiative's new journal, State Crime, over here, published by Pluto Journals and based here at King's College London. And a big welcome to all of those of you in Waterloo. I'm sorry you can't be here, but we're delighted you're watching us live stream. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Penny Green, and with Tony Ward over here, I'm the director of ISCI. We are also, along with Christian Laslett, editors of the new journal. I very much hope that you will subscribe to what will be a scholarly, yet highly accessible journal, tackling questions related to understanding and exposing state violence and state corruption, and the resistance that these forms of powerful criminality engender. If you do subscribe this evening, you will get a hefty discount, so I'd advise you to do it tonight. And I should also add that Noam's books will be available upstairs, and his latest book will be heavily discounted by Pluto Press if you purchase it this evening. I hope to have some specimen copies of the journal available upstairs. So please go to both the Pluto Press and the Pluto Journal's tables and do support us. We'd be really delighted if you did. And before introducing the man that you've all come to hear this evening, I want to take this opportunity to thank all those who've worked so hard to make this event possible. Thanks very much to Rick and the Principal's Office, to Tim Macklem and the School of Law, to our dedicated team of doctoral students and ISCI supporters. A particular thank you to Bev Stoll, who is Noam's PA at MIT. She's an amazing woman and has really facilitated this process. But most especially of all, I want to thank our law school maestro, Adam Tupper, who's been simply magnificent in organising this event. So thank you very much, Adam. Could I ask you now, please, to take a moment to delve into your handbags and coat pockets and take out those mobile phones and switch them off? Thank you very much. So that done? Good. It's now my profound pleasure and privilege to introduce Professor Noam Chomsky, who, as an honorary fellow of ISCI, and I see also John Pilger, who's another honorary fellow of ISCI, sitting right at the front. We're delighted to have you here, John. Noam is very generously launching State Crime this evening. I very much liked the way that Michael Albert, a former student of Noam's at MIT in the 1960s, the way in which he introduced Noam Chomsky at the Rebellious Media Conference on Saturday by saying that Noam is a very special person, not least in denying that there is anything special about himself. He is a brilliant linguist, a searing critic of US foreign policy and crimes of the powerful. He's a man who barely sleeps, but who, with the greatest of generosity and grace, somehow manages to respond to the extraordinary demands made by his millions of supporters around the world. And if you've ever written Noam Chomsky an email, I'm sure you've had a reply. His fierce critique and gentle manner stand as the moral voice of our time. The New York Times have described him as arguably the most important intellectual alive. So it's now a very great honor to hand over to Professor Noam Chomsky.
Thanks, Penny. Whenever I hear that sentence quoted in an introduction, I can't resist adding the next sentence, which doesn't get quoted, which was, how can he write such terrible things about American foreign policy? Well, it's good. I'm glad to be here on the occasion of the launch of the new journal. The journal is new. The topic obviously isn't. Might open with a word about the topic, or at least some subpart of it. Too much to cover. I'll just keep to one of the lesser state crimes, namely international terrorism, putting aside much more serious ones like aggression and so on. That topic, international terrorism, became kind of moved into the general agenda 30 years ago when Ronald Reagan entered office and his administration declared that a prime focus of administration policy would be state-directed international terrorism. I called it the plague of the modern age, return to barbarism in our time, sample some of the fevered rhetoric. They did not have they had in mind Cuban-directed international terrorism, which didn't exist. Russian-directed international terrorism, which maybe you could find with a microscope. They did not, but Cuba was a good choice. Cuba had, in fact, by then already had the record of being the recipient, the target of more international terrorism than probably the rest of the world combined, but they didn't have that in mind, obviously. That was coming from Washington. The Kennedy administration, after the failure of the Bay of Pigs, launched a campaign, Operation Mongoose, to bring the terrors of the earth to Cuba. That was the phrase used by historian Arthur Schlesinger, Kennedy's close Kennedy confidant, Latin American advisor. This was in his biography, more or less official biography of Robert Kennedy, the president's brother, who was assigned the task of supervising the terrors of the earth as his highest priority. Took it very seriously. The first book just came out of oral history, which gives the first kind of record of the voices of the victims. Keith Belender, a Canadian scholar, I think he may be coming here soon. And it was very serious. It was no joke. In fact, it almost led to terminal nuclear war, apart from what it did to Cuba. The operation was supposed to culminate in October 1962. You may recall that that was maybe the most dangerous moment in history. Came very close to a nuclear war, and that was connected with the terrorist crimes, which were supposed to lead to an invasion of Cuba in that month. Well, that's one of many examples, unfortunately, very many. At that time, Reagan, in fact, launched what these days is called a global war on terror. It's pronounced GWAT, if you want to know. Don't ask me why. It also launched, a flood of books and articles, a new profession of terrorism studies, rather dubious profession, but in which England is right at the peak. Among the books and articles were quite a number of mine and friends of mine, all concentrating on just what Reagan said was the plague of the modern age, state-directed international terrorism. But these books and articles can't enter the canon because they have a fundamental error of logic. I and friends of mine used the official definitions of terrorism in the U.S. Code and British government and Army manuals. They're now codified in UN Security Council resolutions defining terror, General Assembly resolutions. And all of that material is kind of politically incorrect, because if you accept those definitions, it follows almost immediately that the United States is one of the maybe the leading actor in leading the plague of the modern age, with Britain, its junior partner, a close second. And that's the wrong conclusion, obviously, so that can't be allowed. A book with a title like Western State Terrorism, edited by a British-American philosopher who was then at Oxford, that can't enter the canon clearly. So it has to be much narrower. I presume this journal won't meet those conditions. It's one thing that was set off in the early 80s when the GWAT began was a search, a scholarly search to craft a definition of terrorism which would have the right properties. It would exclude the terror that we carry out against others, but would include, of course, what they do to us, typically much less. And there are some general there were academic conferences, scholarly meetings, journals, as I said, a profession started, and they all agree that it's a very difficult concept to define terrorism. So you can't use the definitions that are in U.S. and British law, international conventions. And you have to somehow craft a definition with the right properties, and that's hard. If anybody has any suggestions, you can get a PhD at St. Andrews or somewhere by giving them an answer. But so far they haven't really got the right definition, so it's a lot of studies still going on. And it isn't easy. Well, Reagan's GWAT has been disappeared, to borrow the terminology of some of our victims, for good reason. His war on terror led to appalling atrocities very quickly. In Central America, one of the main targets, maybe a couple 100,000 tortured, mutilated corpses. Middle East, tens of thousands. Southern Africa, estimated roughly 1.5 million. South African depredations in the surrounding countries, that's aside from what was going on in South Africa itself, all supported by the United States as part of the defense against terrorism. And the reason was, as the Pentagon explained in 1988, that you had to defend South African apartheid state against what they called one of the more notorious terrorist groups in the world. That was Nelson Mandela's African National Congress. So obviously you had to do that, and that meant supporting their depredations, which were murderous. In fact, Mandela himself just got off the terrorist list about 2 years ago. He can now come to the United States without special dispensation. But none of this is, and a lot more like it, is appropriate for the historical record. So when Bush #2 declared a global war on terror in 2001, that was heralded as something new, not a repetition of an old and ugly story. Right now, state terror is being escalated to new levels. Some of you may be old enough to remember that there once was a concept in British and American law called presumption of innocence. A person is innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. That's long disappeared. Now there's a license to kill anyone you want. Actually, there was a transition from Bush to Obama in this respect. Bush, his GWAT included kidnapping people who you suspected of something or other, sending them off to secret prison camps, not very nice treatment. But Obama has escalated it. Now you don't kidnap them and imprison them without charges, you just kill them. That's a massive global assassination campaign going on, and just a couple of weeks ago it escalated to a new level, went beyond the license to murder suspects to a license to murder people who are suspected of encouraging people to engage in what we call terrorist crimes. So in the New York Times Sunday edition, week before this, there was a headline reading, "As the West celebrates a cleric's death, the Mideast shrugs." So we now not only celebrate the assassination of people accused of, suspected of criminal activity, but even the murder of someone, a cleric in this case, who is alleged to have inspired others to carry out crimes. In this particular case, there's been a little mumbling because the cleric who was killed happens to be an American citizen, and there's some sentimental thoughts that American citizens still have some kind of rights, unlike the unpeople of the world. I'll borrow the phrase of the great British diplomatic historian Mark Curtis in his studies of British state crimes since World War II. It's also worth bearing in mind that the category of terrorism is quite broad. A very striking example is one of the few cases that almost came to trial. Omar Khader is a 15-year-old boy who was captured by American soldiers attacking his village in Afghanistan. He was taken to Guantanamo, stayed there for 7 years without charge, at which point he pleaded guilty, and I won't comment on what that means after 7 years in Guantanamo. So he, after pleading guilty, he was given an 8-year sentence. The charge to which he pleaded guilty was trying to defend his village from American soldiers who were attacking it. And that's obviously terror, so you've got to do this. Well, that's, he's a Canadian citizen, and Canada could extradite him and save him from the next 8 years of prison, but they don't want to step on the toes of the master, so they're courageously refusing to do this. Well, that's, and none of this, of course, is completely new. Some of you may even be old enough to remember the slogan of the Gestapo during Second World War. The slogan was "Terror against terror." They were talking about the need to carry out terror against the partisans who were also terrorists, resisting Nazi aggression. So we aren't breaking any new grounds in that respect. Well, I'll put aside the miserable topic of state terror, which this is a tiny sample, and turn to the announced topic, the contours of world order and the changes they're undergoing, which are very real. Actually, one quite prominent concern these days is what's called American decline, current issue of the major political science journal in the U.S., American Journal of the American Academy of Political Science. You read that it is a common theme that the United States, which only a few years ago was hailed to stride the world as a colossus with unparalleled power and unmatched appeal, is in decline, ominously facing the prospects of its final decay. And there's also a common corollary to that, namely that power is shifting, continuing its shift from east to west, first to Western Europe, then across the Atlantic, now take another step forward to the rising powers of China and India. If there were any truth to that, it would mean that we're essentially going back to the 18th century, when they were indeed the commercial industrial centers of the world, before Britain helped take care of that. American decline, in fact, is very real. The corollary, I think, is extremely dubious. They've had very impressive economic growth, but these are very poor countries. They have very severe internal problems. The world is, in fact, surely getting a lot more diverse, but despite America's decline, which is real, in the foreseeable future, I don't see any indication that there's any competitor for hegemonic global power. Well, there are further qualifications that are in order. For one thing, the decline is not something new, contrary to what's being said. It started in 1945. In 1945, the United States reached the peak of its power and wealth, historically unprecedented. During the war, of course, ended the Depression. U.S. industrial production virtually quadrupled. Competing industrial societies were devastated or destroyed, certainly severely harmed. The U.S. literally had 50% of the world's wealth. There's never been anything like that in history. It also had incomparable security, controlled the entire hemisphere, controlled both oceans, controlled the opposite sides of the oceans, and it was an enormous amount of power, and it began to decline right away. So by 1949, there was a serious blow to U.S. power. It has a name. It's called the loss of China, which is a kind of an interesting phrase, never questioned. You can only lose something that you possess, like I can't lose, your books. But we, of course, possess China, or are supposed to, and that's just taken for granted. And since we possess it and it became independent in 1949, we lost it. And the loss of China is a major issue in world affairs. That was a blow to wartime plans that had been developed during the Second World War. Roosevelt's planners understood very well that the United States was going to emerge from the war in a position of extraordinary power. And they laid plans, careful plans, which were later implemented, sophisticated plans to organize and run the world that they expected to dominate. They constructed what they called a grand area. The grand area was to include, of course, the entire Western Hemisphere, the whole Far East, and the former British Empire, which the U.S. was taking over. Britain was to be reduced to a junior partner, as the Foreign Office ruefully recognized. Taking over the British Empire meant crucially taking over the energy reserves of Western Asia, called the Middle East, which were staggering and understood to be staggering. State Department, 1945, called that a stupendous source of strategic power, one of the greatest material prizes in world history. Eisenhower later described it as the strategically most important part of the world. One of Roosevelt's leading advisors, liberal analyst, statesman A. Burley, observed that if we can control Middle East oil resources, we can control the world. And the U.S. didn't intend to give that up and doesn't intend to now. That's highly relevant to current affairs. There's one of the leading British diplomatic historians, Geoffrey Warner, one of the most respected specialists on the period, is quite correct when he writes that the documentary record shows clearly that President Roosevelt was aiming at United States hegemony in the post-war world. In the early parts of the war, 41, 42, it was expected that Germany would survive as a major power. So it'd be a German-run world and the grand area, an American-run world. After the Russian armies started grinding the Germans down after Stalingrad, the planning changed. It was recognized that Germany wouldn't survive, and the grand area plans were expanded to include the commercial and industrial center of Eurasia, Western Europe, and also Southern Europe, which was important critically because of its perceived role in protecting energy shipments from the Middle East. In fact, Greece was part of the Near East Department of the State Department until 1974, after the US-backed dictatorship was overthrown. And it was not a trivial matter to control all these places, plenty of violence. Within these domains, however large they could be, there were specific plans. I might as well read them. They're still formulated. The U.S. is still in operation, though the U.S. is much less able to impose them. Within these domains, the U.S. was to maintain unquestioned power with military and economic supremacy while ensuring the limitation of any exercise of sovereignty by states that might interfere with U.S. global designs. It's a pretty expansive vision, and the doctrines do still prevail. You read them in government statements, but the power to implement them has indeed declined. Well, the wartime plans were not unrealistic. Even before the war, the U.S. had been far and away the richest country in the world, and as I say, the war greatly enhanced that wealth and power. And the plans were sophisticated. Each region of the world was assigned what was called its function within the global system. So Southeast Asia its function was to provide raw materials and resources to the former colonial masters in Britain and Malaya and so on, so they could recover from the war and play their proper role within the U.S.-dominated system. Each region of the world was discussed. Some of them were kind of interesting, like Africa. This was all planned by George Kennan and his State Department planning staff. Kennan is sort of one of the extreme doves. In fact, he was kicked out of the State Department because he was considered not tough enough for this harsh world. It's interesting to read his proposals. With regard to Africa, Kennan proposed that, he said the U.S. at the time wasn't much interested in Africa. So he said we should hand over Africa to the Europeans for them to exploit, that's his phrase, for their reconstruction. I mean, you look at the history of Africa and Europe, you might think of a different possible relationship, but naturally that was never entertained. By now that's no longer true. The U.S. is not willing to give up Africa to Europe to exploit, wants to take part in it itself. Well, as I say, by 1949, this grand vision was already beginning to crumble. The loss of China was serious. Shortly after that, it came the threat of loss of Southeast Asia by 1950 or so. The first problem there was Indochina, which really didn't matter that much in itself, but a much bigger threat was Indonesia. Indonesia has quite rich resources, and the idea that Indonesia might, the loss of Indonesia, that could be serious. Actually, the planning for the Vietnam War is worth understanding. It's sophisticated. And in fact, the U.S. won most of its objectives. I disagree with a lot of my friends about, and this general conclusion that the U.S. lost the war. I think it basically won the war. If you look at its objectives, which were laid out in the early 50s, we've got plenty of documentary material about this now. Indochina, while not all that significant in itself, was regarded as what's sometimes called in the internal record, it was regarded as a virus that might spread contagion. The virus is the threat of independent, successful development, which might spread contagion in that others might follow the model and try to pursue the same path themselves. And that could be dangerous. If the virus spread, say, to Indonesia, and they pursued a path of independent development, and also to the other regions, Southeast Asia, Japan, it's called the super domino by Asia historian John Dower. Japan might move to accommodate itself to increasingly independent Southeast Asia and become its industrial center, technical, industrial, commercial center. And that would have meant, in effect, that the United States would have lost the Pacific phase of World War II, which in the Pacific region was fought to prevent Japan from establishing what was called a new order, in which that would be its role. In the early 1950s, the United States was not prepared to lose World War II, so something had to be done about the virus. Well, there's a way to deal with a virus that might spread contagion. A very simple way. You kill the virus and you inoculate the potential victims. The potential victims are inoculated by installing vicious, murderous regimes which keep the place under control, and that's what was done. By the mid-1960s, Vietnam had been pretty much destroyed. It wasn't going to be a model for anybody. And the surrounding regions were mostly brutal dictatorships were installed. The final, most significant step was, in fact, Indonesia. In 1965, there was a military coup in Indonesia, supported, maybe instigated by the United States, which was very successful. The Suharto coup, it immediately killed hundreds of thousands of people, mostly landless peasants, destroyed the only functioning political party, a party of the poor, and opened up Indonesia to free exploitation of its resources by the West. And that was celebrated with absolute euphoria. Western commentators couldn't keep down their enthusiasm. Britain too, but the New York Times described what was going on pretty accurately. The New York Times described what they called a staggering mass slaughter in Indonesia, which was a gleam of light in Asia. That was the conclusion of their liberal commentator, James Reston, Hope Where There Once Was None, Boiling Bloodbath, a tremendous success, and so on. Interestingly, McGeorge Bundy, who was the National Security Advisor for Kennedy and Johnson in later years, looking back in retrospect, he concluded that the United States probably should have pulled out of Vietnam in 1965 after the Indonesia coup, because they'd already won the war. Vietnam was destroyed, the region was inoculated, no fear of losing the Second World War, so it was a mistake to waste resources to try to destroy the last traces. I should say that the same reasoning held for Cuba. Right away, as soon as Cuba liberated itself, 1959, within months there were internal plans to overthrow the government. Bombing started a couple of months later. When Kennedy came in, it all escalated pretty sharply. Kennedy intended to concentrate on Latin American issues. He had a Latin American mission headed by Arthur Schlesinger. And they gave a report to the incoming president, which is very much worth reading. It was summarized by Schlesinger, well-known liberal historian. He explained to the incoming president that the problem in Cuba is what he called the Castro idea of taking matters into your own hands, an idea which might influence others in the region who face similar problems and might try to do the same thing, so the virus would spread contagion. And the cure was the usual one. Let's try to destroy the virus, and let's protect the region. And right then started the series of military coups, first in Brazil, then all over the place, installing really murderous, vicious regimes. Finally reached Central America in the 80s, a plague of repression like nothing that ever happened in the hemisphere. And they couldn't quite get rid of the virus, but it was contained. The terror war restricted any likelihood of growth and development. Of course, there's a very tough embargo that was imposed and still remains, because the CIA explained that the problem with Cuba is what they called Castro's successful defiance of policies going back to the Monroe Doctrine. That's 1823, which proclaimed that the U.S. should dominate the hemisphere. Couldn't do it then. The British were a deterrent, but now they could do it, and that can't be tolerated. And if you take a look at the policy, it gives you a lot of insight into how foreign policy is formulated. For 30 or 40 years, public opinion in the United States has been strongly in favor of normalizing relations with Cuba. It's normal for public opinion to be dismissed in what we call democracies. But more interesting in this case is that major sectors of U.S. business want to normalize relations. That includes agribusiness, energy, pharmaceuticals, and quite significant parts of the business world. They want to normalize relations, and their concerns are dismissed. That is unusual, not unique. There are other cases, and they're interesting cases. But the state dedication to punishing successful defiance overwhelms the usual modalities of policy formation, which are typically in the hands of private capital. That shows there's a really significant state interest involved. There are other cases, and you learn a lot from them. Unfortunately, these are not studied in international relations theory, which is quite unfortunate. But if you look at them carefully, you can learn a lot. Well, as I said, American decline started quickly. Meanwhile, subversion and violence continued through the South. Don't have to run through that. You're familiar with it. It goes on constantly. Horrible story. Europe was particularly important in the Grand Area planning for obvious reasons. And there were plans put in place right away for Europe to be reconstructed But there was a preliminary condition. In order to reconstruct, thanks. Before Europe could be reconstructed, it was necessary to impose what's called stability, meaning subordination to U.S. power. That meant it was necessary to destroy the anti-fascist resistance, which was the first target of U.S. and British forces when they invaded the continent. First in Italy, then Greece, then beyond. That meant destroying the labor movement, independent labor movement, and the left, which was the core of the anti-fascist resistance, and reinstating the traditional order, including plenty of fascist collaborators. It began during the war, when the British and Americans started marching up through Italy, and was carried out consistently throughout the region, often very bloody, as in Greece, plenty of subversion, as in Italy. Germany was, of course, particularly important, powerful state, and it was necessary to destroy, veto union constitutions, forcefully terminate social experiments, and in general to wall off Western Germany from the Eastern zone. That was George Kennan's phrase. We had to wall off the West to ensure that there wouldn't be any contagion coming from elements of radical democracy in the East. And that was done. The Marshall Plan came along. It doubtless aided European construction, but that wasn't its only goal. In large part, the Marshall Plan was in fact a taxpayer subsidy to major U.S. corporations. And that's appreciated by the beneficiaries. They don't read the foreign policy literature. They just look at their records. So the Reagan administration pointed out that the Marshall Plan set the stage for large amounts of private U.S. direct investment in Europe, laying the groundwork for the rise of post-war multinational corporations. And Businessweek, main business journal, described the multinational corporations as the economic expressions of the political framework established by post-war policymakers in which American business prospered and expanded on overseas orders, fueled initially by the dollars of the Marshall Plan, protected from negative developments like, say, a labor movement or something like that, by the umbrella of American power. It was always recognized and feared that Europe might follow an independent course, maybe sort of Gaullist course of Europe, independent Europe from the Atlantic to the Urals. And there were measures taken to prevent that. One of them is NATO, and it's quite interesting to see what happened to NATO when the theoretical pretext for it, the Russian hordes, disappeared. I'll come back to that in a moment. Well, meanwhile, decolonization followed its agonizing course. By 1970, the U.S. power had significantly declined. It wasn't 50% of the world's wealth anymore. It was about 25%, which it still approximately is. It's still colossal, but nothing like what it was at the end of the Second World War. So there had been significant American decline. And by that time, 1970, the world was becoming what's called tripolar economically, three major economic centers: North America, based in the U.S., Western Europe, mostly German-based, and East Asia, already the most dynamic region of the world at that time, Japan-based, since expanded to China. 20 years later, 1990, the Soviet Union collapsed. Now, for those interested in the reality of the Cold War, that's a very important place to look, to ask what happened when the superpower enemy collapsed. That's very instructive, and I urge you to look at it. Of course, Washington immediately instituted new policies. Now, they're all perfectly public. You don't have to search hidden records. This is the first Bush administration. They immediately presented a new national security strategy, a new defense budget to deal with the world after the Russians have disappeared. And it's interesting reading. They started by saying that we still have to maintain a huge military system that's still necessary, and not to protect ourselves from the Russians because they're not around, but because of the technological sophistication of third world powers. Now, if you're a properly educated intellectual, you're not supposed to laugh when you hear that. We'd still need the same system because the third world is so technologically sophisticated. So we don't laugh. You've got a college degree, you understand that makes sense. It was still necessary, they said, to maintain the defense industrial base. Now, that phrase is a euphemism for high-tech industry. United States and Britain believe in free markets for the weak, but not for us, please. For us, we need a powerful state that sustains the economy, saves the wealthy, and so on. And the high-tech economy, the modern high-tech economy, your computers, the internet, IT revolution, and so on, mostly comes out of the Pentagon, actually the places where I was working in the 1950s and 60s. About 30 years of development, mostly in the state sector, before it was handed over to private power for profit. And that's the way the economy pretty much runs. It goes back to the early days of British industrialization, when Britain followed the same path of powerful state intervention to create and maintain an industrial economy. U.S. picked it up, and same with every developed society. So we still needed to, the state still had to subsidize the defense industrial base, meaning the next stage of high technology. One of the most interesting parts was about intervention forces. It concluded that we have to maintain intervention forces directed at the Middle East. And then comes an interesting phrase, where the serious threats to our interest could not have been laid at the Kremlin's door. In other words, they were independent radical nationalism. So sorry, folks, we've been lying to you for 50 years, but it's too late to go on with that. So now we'll tell the truth. We need the intervention forces in case those guys get out of hand, which is in fact what they were for all along. But it was now quietly conceded. Well, here too in the Middle East, it had, as everywhere, it had been necessary to destroy viruses that might spread contagion. Many examples: Iran in 1953, Iraq 10 years later, most significantly Nasser's Egypt, which was kind of the center of secular nationalism. That happened in 1967. The war is described, justly as Israel-Egypt war, but there was another war going on in the background, a Saudi-Egyptian war. In fact, they were actually at war in southern Yemen, and there was a lot of concern that secular nationalism might spread from Egypt to the radical Islamic dictatorships, the oil dictatorships. And in fact, Britain and the United States have pretty consistently supported radical Islamism against secular nationalism. On Britain, Curtis has a good recent book on this, and the same's true in the United States, which kind of makes sense if you think about it. The real problem is viruses that will spread contagion, and maybe efforts to pursue an independent path. So that continued. 1967 also established U.S.-Israeli relations in their present form. Before that, they weren't so exceptional. Since then, they have been. And the reason was it was recognized that Israel performed a great service to the United States and its Saudi ally or client, whatever you want to call it. It destroyed the threat of secular nationalism. Then came what's called the Nixon Doctrine, which was public. The Nixon Doctrine, mostly for the Middle East, stated that the structure of what they call Middle East security, meaning supporting U.S. dominance in the region, would be, of course, the dictatorships, the radical Islamic dictatorships like Saudi Arabia, our major friend, And then the dictatorships have to be protected from the populations, and that would be done by what they called cops on the beat, surrounding states, preferably non-Arab. They do better killing Arabs. And they would protect the power of the dictatorships from their own populations. Of course, and Israel, the cops at the time were the Iran, which was then under the Shah, Pakistan, providing royal guard for the Saudi royal family, intervening when it had to, Turkey, major power, and now Israel. Israel could be a cop on the beat. Unstated but obvious, where that police headquarters are in Washington, and there's a branch office in London where the junior partners assign some roles now and then. So that's the basic structure of power, and things have changed, but the basic thinking still remains, and the core of the U.S.-Israel relationship is still sort of like that. Well, let's go back to the end of the Cold War 20 years ago. The fate of NATO is quite instructive. I remember NATO was supposed to be there to protect Western Europe from the Russian hordes. Well, no more Russian hordes, so what should happen? If anyone believed the propaganda of the preceding years, NATO should have disappeared. It's not needed anymore. That's not what happened. In fact, the opposite happened. It expanded. NATO immediately expanded to the east, incidentally in violation of pledges to Gorbachev, who was willing to make accommodations on condition that NATO would not expand 1 inch to the east, as the Bush administration assured him. Later, when immediately NATO expanded to East Germany, then beyond, Gorbachev complained. He was unhappy about this, and Washington explained to him that if he's naive enough to accept promises from the United States, that's his problem. But a real statesman would know better. So that's gone, and NATO continues to expand to the east. By now, it's gone way beyond the current official role of NATO. Its official role is, first of all, to serve as an international U.S.-run intervention force, but mainly to protect the infrastructure of the global energy system. That means to protect sea lanes, pipelines all over the world, and Europe is supposed to go along with that, as indeed it does. At that I mentioned before that there was this euphoria at the time about the magnificence of the U.S., a great colossus, and there was. I mean, a very strange period of intellectual history. You go back to the 1990s, the rhetoric of Western intellectuals was astonishing. Sounds very much like North Korea. So Clinton's foreign policy was described by leading intellectuals as having as entering a noble phase with a saintly glow. The first time in history, a country is guided by altruism alone, dedicated to principles and values, an idealistic new world bent on ending inhumanity. At last, it could carry forward unhindered the emerging international norm of humanitarian intervention. I mean, we're entering a magnificent world. It's interesting to read. It's not that long ago, and it was all over. Well, not everybody was so enraptured, needless to say. In the global south, the traditional victims, they saw it a little bit differently. So they bitterly condemned what they called the so-called right of humanitarian intervention, recognizing it to be just the old right of imperial domination. And there were some more sober voices at home, I should say. Not everybody was following the Kim Il-sung style. And so, for example, there were prestigious voices that pointed out that the United States was becoming the rogue superpower, considered the single greatest external threat to their societies of the third world, and that the prime rogue state today is the United States. These were not marginal voices. That's Samuel Huntington, very prestigious Harvard professor, and Robert Jervis in his presidential address for the American Political Science Association. So not quiet voices, but they were kind of drowned out in the enthusiasm for the noble phase, saintly glow, etc. After Bush Jr. took over, this hostility to the United States and the global South, particularly the Middle East, grew enormously. His approval ratings shot down. Obama has carried out an actual major feat. He succeeded in lowering his popularity in the Arab world even below Bush. That's not a small achievement. He's now down, I think, to 5% approval in Egypt and similar numbers elsewhere. Well, meanwhile, the decline continued. In the last decade, something very significant happened. South America has been lost, as the term is. That threat had been around for a long time. There was plenty of brutal interventions and so on, but it finally happened. By the last decade, they've really moved for the first time in 500 years towards integration, independence. All U.S. military bases have been kicked out of South America, and they're really going their own way. Just right now, a new organization has been formed, CELAC, which includes every country of the Western Hemisphere, apart from what's called the Anglosphere, Britain's extensions, United States and Canada. They're out. The rest of the hemisphere's moving independently. If that actually functions, there'll be another great loss, a loss to the Grand Area Planning. And it's serious. When the Nixon administration was planning to destroy another virus, the parliamentary democracy in Chile, and install the Pinochet dictatorship, the National Security Council, main planning body, advised that if the United States cannot control Latin America, it won't be able to achieve a successful order elsewhere in the world, that is, to run the rest of the world. So it's critical to maintain control over Latin America. Okay, that's been lost. Well, that was bad enough, but the Middle East is far more significant, and that's beginning to happen. I already quoted the government assessments of the significance of the Middle East, and planners recognized, as I quoted, that if you can control the Middle East, if we can continue to control the Middle East, we can control the world, and as a corollary, if you lose control of the Middle East, control of the world declines. Well, policies are pretty much the same. It doesn't have much to do with access to Middle East oil. The U.S. had the same policies when it was the major oil producer and wasn't taking a drop of oil from the Middle East. The issue is control, and it maintains. There's a further danger in U.S. hegemony, and that's the possibility that the Middle East might move towards some form of democracy. The Middle East and Northern Africa, what's called MENA. Now, of course, there's lots of rhetoric about our yearning for democracy and on, but there are very elementary reasons why the United States and its allies can't tolerate democracy in the Middle East and will do anything to prevent it. To understand why, it's only necessary to look at the polls of public opinion. Polls are taken by leading American polling agencies. They're released by prestigious institutions. They barely get reported, but planners certainly know about them. So, for example, they know that in Egypt, the most important country, about 90% of the population regard the United States and Israel as the major threats to their existence. Maybe 10% think of Iran as a threat. They don't like Iran, but they don't consider it a threat. In fact, about 80% think the region would be more secure if Iran would have nuclear weapons. Independently of this, they don't want Iran to have nuclear weapons, but in the context of balancing the major threats, U.S. and Israel, 80% think that would be a good idea. And you get fairly similar figures throughout the region, varies a little bit. Well, you know, the last thing the United States and Britain and France want is for public opinion to have an influence on policy for obvious reasons. And that's supposed to be what democracy means. So they'll do everything possible to stifle democracy. And it's kind of interesting that after the partial victories in Egypt, the regime is still pretty much intact, but there have been victories. They shouldn't be understated. The first actions that were taken in Egypt are very threatening to the U.S. and Israel. So right after the overthrow of Mubarak, the Egyptian government, I'm getting late. Yeah, okay. The Egyptian government permitted Iranian ships to transit the Suez Canal, first time in 30 years. That included military vessels, maybe submarines. Mediterranean's supposed to be an American lake. Nobody's supposed to interfere there, especially Iran, you know, the hated enemy. They're moving towards relations with, better relations with Iran. Egypt also sponsored a unification between Hamas and Fatah. Whether it'll get anywhere is another question, but they did try to implement a unification. That's extremely threatening to the U.S. and Israel for 20 years, ever since the Oslo Accords. The Oslo Accords, incidentally, declare that Gaza and the West Bank are a single territorial entity. And as soon as the U.S. and Israel got the accords through, they immediately proceeded to do the opposite, to try to break Gaza from the West Bank. That's quite important, because if any kind of Palestinian entity ever arises, if it's separated from Gaza, not only does it lose a lot of its population, but it loses its only access to the outside world. You take a look at the geography. Whatever's left of the West Bank will be contained within Israel and the Jordanian dictatorship. And if you look at the actual plans of Israeli settlement, which are proceeding, they make that even narrower. So separating it from Gaza is quite important, and steps towards somehow overcoming that division would be considered very harmful and are strongly opposed by the U.S. and Israel. The most serious problem, and the one they're really worried about, is the 1979 Israel-Egypt peace treaty. Now, public opinion in Egypt doesn't want to get rid of the peace treaty, but they don't like the way the dictatorship interpreted it. It was interpreted right away, and Israel and the U.S. understood this, as giving license to Israel to do anything it wanted. So the Egyptian deterrent is gone. Israel's now free to attack its northern neighbor, Lebanon, as it did almost immediately, and to escalate its operations in the West Bank. Well, the Egyptian public didn't like that, still doesn't like it. And if they have any influence, they might threaten the interpretation of the treaty. The way that's described in the West is the threatening the cornerstone of stability in the Middle East. Stability, remember, has a technical meaning. Do what we say, you know. And in the literal meaning, the treaty is the cornerstone of instability in the Middle East, like invading Lebanon, you know, taking over the West Bank, but not from the Western point of view. Well, there's, I'll skip it a lot more since time's late. I'm getting told to shut up. But there's a lot more to say, but I just want to make a comment about one further crucial fact. American decline is quite real, and in a large measure it's self-inflicted. Now, that has to do with the policies that have been instituted since the 1970s. I mean, a major change in world order took place in 1970. The international economic system was radically redesigned. In the West, that meant two major developments, shift towards financialization The financial institutions have just exploded since that time. They don't do anything for the economy except create a lot of concentrated wealth, and of course continual crashes and so on. But the economy became financialized, and manufacturing started being offshored. It continues, but somewhere else. That had very significant effects. Both of these developments had to do with kind of an underlying factor, a declining rate of profit in manufacturing, which made it better to invest in games with money, playing games with speculating against currencies and so on, and production offshore. And in fact, what the West has been doing, the United States, Britain, and others, is living out a kind of a nightmare that was described by Adam Smith and David Ricardo, the classical economists. I mean, they understood very well that what could happen. Of course, they were interested in England, and they described what could happen if in England, the people who Smith called the masters of mankind, the merchants and manufacturers, if they decided to do their business abroad, like invest abroad and import from abroad. And Smith concluded the business would prosper, but England would suffer. However, he said this is not going to happen, and the reason is because British manufacturers and merchants would have what's called a home bias. They'd prefer to do their business in England. So as if by an invisible hand, England would be saved from the ravages of a globalized market. Actually, that's a hard paragraph to miss. It's the one time when the phrase invisible hand appears in Wealth of Nations in a critique of neoliberal globalization. David Ricardo essentially said the same thing. He said, law of comparative advantage is great, but if England merchants and manufacturers decide, his model to invest in Portugal and import from Portugal and so on, it's all going to collapse. But he said he hoped that at least sentimental reasons would prevent them from doing this. They'd prefer for the home country to prosper. So they knew what they were talking about. They were not fools. And it's happening. We're living in the middle of that nightmare, just what they predicted. And the effect is very narrow concentration of wealth. The United States has gone off the spectrum. I mean, a tiny sector of the population is so small that the Census Bureau can't even pick them up. About 0.1% is responsible for most of the massive inequality. And of course, concentration of economic power immediately turns into concentration of political power, meaning you get further legislation to escalate the same process. And a vicious cycle is underway that is leading to, it's not becoming a third world, but it's having very significant effects on the nature of the society, Britain as well. And I won't go into that any further, but the business world understands it very well. And I should say the successes of the policy are quite real, apart from the radical concentration of wealth. By shedding the remnants of political democracy, which is what is happening, they're laying the basis for carrying the lethal process forward, and will, as long as the victims are willing to suffer in silence, not just in the United States, of course. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Noam. Noam's kindly agreed to answer questions. We've got about 10 minutes for questions, and can I ask, we have a couple of roving microphones. If you could put your hand up, and we have Rachel here with one and Melanie over here with another. Please, we'll find you. But we only have 10 minutes, so the questions must be questions, not contributions. Questions, please. Okay, Harry, Jeremy. So if we could get one up to Harry here.
Hello, John Linden from One Voice. It's just interesting the way that you described Israel's role within the Middle East, and also, I suppose, it taking orders from Washington being a traditional way of viewing its policeman's role. I just wonder whether you could talk a little bit about whether there'll be a change in calculus on the part of US foreign policy and also Israeli foreign policy if we do see a democratic surge within the Arab world, and if Israel's behaviour becomes more of a burden to US foreign policy than an asset. Thank you.
It's happening. It's very important. I don't know if you can hear me. Is this working? Is this working? Yeah. That's actually beginning to happen. There's some interesting indications of recalculation in high U.S. planning circles of the value of Israel's role. You probably saw the statement of David Petraeus, the head of the Central Command, who said, Israel's intransigence is stirring up dangers and oppositions to U.S. forces in the field. We got these armies out there protecting freedom, and the way Israel's acting is creating opposition to them. He was told to shut up, and he instantly shut up. But he's reflecting opinions that are increasingly being voiced in the military and intelligence, and sometimes even in political circles. If that extends, which it could, you could have a wave of anti-Semitism in the United States, which would be ferocious. It's not that far below the surface. I'm old enough to remember. But you start purveying the conception that these Israeli Jews are threatening our brave boys and girls in Afghanistan. You can guess the reaction. That could very well happen. And there was recently a sort of a more polite version of this. There's a group called the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, kind of a conservative think tank that works out international policy, pretty conservative. If you know Andrew Kortesman, he's one of their Middle East specialists. They just came out with a study, quiet study, saying that the United States ought to rethink its reflexive commitment to Israeli power and violence, and may be becoming harmful to our interests. Well, I don't know if that'll grow or not. There's a lot of factors opposed to it, including ones that are rarely considered. And so there's a lot to overcome. One factor is the strategic relationship. Another one is a couple of properties of the Anglosphere, Britain and its offshoots. These are, by comparative standards, deeply religious societies. Christian Zionism long precedes Jewish Zionism. It's not just evangelicals, it's high circles like Lord Balfour and Lord Lloyd George and the Roosevelt administration and others, and it's pretty strong. So, for example, during the First World War, when the British General Allenby conquered Jerusalem, you read the headlines in the major press, the elite press. Richard the Lionhearted has won the Crusades, defeating Saladin. He's now saved the Holy Land for us. He's gotten rid of the pagans. And the Holy Book says that the next thing that's supposed to happen is the Jews go back to Palestine. That's when you get the Balfour Declaration, the mandate, reading this in, and so on. Of course, the very small Zionist movement tried to capitalize on this, and it continued. The high officials in the Roosevelt administration described the return of Jews to Palestine as literally the most important event in history. And that continues right up to the present. There's another fact about the Anglosphere which is significant. The Anglosphere has a somewhat different history of imperialism from most of the West, some exceptions. But in the Anglosphere, the British colonists exterminated the population, pretty much exterminated them, didn't get rid of all of them everywhere. In the United States, virtually total, Canada most, Australia, same. And Britain has a kind of a similar history in its expansion. This did happen in some other places, like the French in Algeria, but most of the imperial record is quite different. And that means in the Anglosphere, there's a kind of an intuitive support for the idea that this outpost of European civilization should get rid of the natives. I mean, we did it, so it's got to be right. And they're doing it, and besides, it's following God's will. And that's a pretty significant factor, I think, somewhat underestimated, a cultural factor, in addition to the strategic factors. And, but it can change. I mean, there have been a number of times in the past when Washington simply compelled Israel to abandon plans that it desperately wanted to pursue. And when the orders come from Washington, they got to follow it. That's true even of the Bush administration, the second Bush administration, the first one also. And that could happen. But what the consequences would be, interesting to ask. Actually, what Britain and Europe do is also quite important. Just take the last couple of weeks. I mean, there's, the West has this illusion, probably conscious illusion, about a negotiating process in Palestine. There's this honest broker, the United States, who's trying to bring together the two recalcitrant sides and dedicating enormous efforts to this, but can't quite make it. It's a total farce. For 35 years, the United States has unilaterally blocked a very broad international consensus on a political settlement. The first veto was 1976, and it continues. If there was a serious negotiating process, it would have some neutral party, maybe Brazil, running it, and on one side would be the U.S. and Israel, and the other side would be the Palestinians. Well, that's not the way it's presented in elite Western culture. Now, the Palestinians did make an effort in the last couple of weeks to try to get around the idle negotiating process. I mean, the U.S. and Israel are perfectly happy to let negotiations go on forever while Israel takes over everything it wants and so on. The Palestinians did make an effort to get around it at the UN, and it's interesting to see what happened. Almost the entire world supports the Palestinian call for statehood. The U.S., of course, opposes it. And so the crucial question is, what's Europe going to do? And Europe totally capitulated. Very courageous, I must say. Totally capitulated. In fact, they kind of rubbed it in by picking the pathetic Tony Blair to deliver the message to the Palestinians, saying, skip it, go back into your corner. And that's a pretty pathetic performance, I must say, and very significant. I mean, if Europe refuses to act with, even minimal courage and integrity, it's going to be very hard for anything to happen. And they're not forced to. Europe can be an independent force in world affairs. It's a choice.
Thanks, Noam. A question over here. And then, Rachel, if you could hand the mic to Harry here in the centre.
With that convincing and bleak analysis, what is to be done?
Sorry. What's to be done?
What's to be done after that bleak analysis?
Well, I think it's pretty obvious. We live in fairly free countries. There's not a lot of repression by comparative standards. You have lots of opportunities, lots of things to be done. Everything from, like right now, for example, there are very important developments. The Occupy movements, which began in Wall Street, off Wall Street, have grown very fast, spreading all over the country. I think there's one coming up in London next week. These are pretty important. I mean, the goals are not very precisely formulated, but things can emerge. But it's a sign that the public are saying, we're just not willing to continue to be victims of this. And if you decide not to be victims, you can do almost anything. You can change the policies. You can, they can move on to other, well beyond the political regime. In fact, it's kind of intriguing to look at the formulated demands of the Occupy Wall Street, you know, the main one. They have formulated their demands. You can read them on the internet. And they're quite interesting. For example, they begin by describing themselves as acting in the tradition of the uprisings in the 1930s. It's US-oriented. The uprising in the 1930s that led to the New Deal, the Civil Rights Movement, and the Arab Spring. Well, it would be nice if that were true, but it's not true in crucial ways which can be overcome. In the 1930s, it wasn't Occupy Wall Street. It was reconstitution of a labor movement that had been smashed in the 1920s, beginnings of industrial organizing, and quite significant militant activities. Workers were beginning to sit-down strikes. Sit-down strikes are terrifying to the owners. A sit-down strike is just one step before recognizing, okay, we'll kick you out. We don't need owners and managers. We'll take it over and run it ourselves, which they can do. And the business world was petrified. If you read the business press at the time, kind of trembling in fear. Well, we're a long way from that. That didn't happen, but it did lead to New Deal legislation, which was pretty significant, kind of social democratic legislation. The Civil Rights Movement also, you know, everyone thinks of the March on Washington, Martin Luther King, I Have a Dream, etc. There was a long background, a background of hard, difficult struggle. I won't run through. A lot of young people were in the forefront. It was pretty bloody. It was pretty repressive. And also the Civil Rights Movement up to that point had Northern support. Northern liberals are perfectly happy with denunciation of racist Alabama sheriffs. So they say, pat Martin Luther King on the head. Shortly after that, the Civil Rights Movement and King moved on to King expressed opposition to the Vietnam War, but more significantly, he moved on to class issues. He went on to try to organize a poor people's movement. When he was assassinated, he was on his way to Washington to take steps towards that, and he was involved. He appeared in a sanitation workers' strike. That's when he was assassinated. You listen to the speeches on Martin Luther King Day. They pretty much stopped with "I Have a Dream." When it went on to class issues, the Northern liberals didn't want to have anything to do with that, you know, and that part of King's career is kind of whitewashed out. That's worth remembering. As far as the Arab Spring is concerned, there are some facts about it that shouldn't be ignored. They've been brought out particularly by Joel Bynum. He's an American scholar who's done a lot of work on the Arab labor movement for years. And he's pointed out something which I think is quite correct, that the successes of the Arab Spring, which are real, even if partial, correlate with the existence of an active militant labor movement with a long tradition of struggle. So in the two countries where something notable has happened, Tunisia and Egypt, that's what they have. In Egypt particularly, there's a militant labor movement that's been operating for years, crushed by the dictatorship, but with some victories too. In fact, the current July 25th movement, which in the West is usually described as, sophisticated young people with Twitter and so on. It's not false, but it's worth remembering that the movement has a name. It's the April 6th movement. It doesn't mean anything in the West, but it means something in Egypt. April 6th, 2008 is the date when the militant labor movement in Egypt had declared major strike actions at big industrial installations with supporting demonstrations all over, and it was crushed by the dictatorship, U.S., Western, UK-backed dictatorship. We don't know about it, but they remember, and that's the April 6th movement. And in fact, when the labor unions began to enter into the protests, they became much more substantial. A lot of more to say, but I think this is one core element that shouldn't be overlooked, and that plainly is lacking so far. The labor leadership doesn't want to have anything to do with, Occupy movements and so on. So there are big gaps to fill, and but they can be filled, just like these things were done. And you have lots of opportunities. We're, by comparative standards, again, very free of repression, means lots of opportunity, lots of actions that can be taken place. It's a question of choice as to whether to be passive in the face of what's going on or to take over and do something about it.
Thank you, Noam. I think we've got time for only one more question, I'm afraid, but there will be plenty of time to talk and discuss these issues at the reception. Final question, Harry.
You gave an absolutely fantastic but rather daunting analysis of the kind of a reasonably organised global capitalist machine during your speech. And I was just wondering what you think are is the chances of building a kind of a globalised resistance where kind of local struggles are joined up and where people here perhaps could support struggles in other parts of the world where they have less freedom than we have, and where you thought that the impetus for that sort of movement might come from?
Actually, I think the prospects are pretty good. All of these losses that I've described are cases where parts of the world have freed themselves from Western domination, and it's significant ones. South America, to an extent the Middle East, East Asia, these are big changes. And in fact, there have been, the last 10 years, global movements which have been involved with this. The World Social Forum and its offshoots in many places. These provide, they haven't been pursued enough, but they provide instruments for cooperative work. In fact, it's kind of interesting to look at. One of the dramatic moments during the Egyptian uprising in this year was around late February, when one of the main labor leaders in Egypt, Kamal Abbas, sent a message to Madison, Wisconsin, to where there were popular demonstrations to try to protect labor rights that are under attack. And his message was, we, the Egyptian workers, are expressing our solidarity for your struggles. It's a little sick that that's the direction it has to go, but it's real, and there's many more possibilities for the direction, for it to go in the opposite direction.
Well, thank you again very much, Noam, for a fascinating and fabulous talk. I'd like now to warmly invite you to a reception, which will be upstairs. There are ushers who will usher you up. Please enjoy the rest of the evening, and thank you again for your support. Please do support our new journal. We'd be really pleased if you subscribe tonight at that fantastic discount that Pluto Journals are offering. And thank you again for coming. Thank you again, Noam, for a fantastic evening.